In the heart of Montana's Gallatin Valley, where rolling hills stretch endlessly towards snow-capped peaks, an abandoned stone church stood like a forgotten monument to faith. For 37 years, this Gothic revival structure had watched seasons change through broken stained glass windows, its bell tower silent, its pews gathering dust and debris. Local real estate agents had given up trying to sell it. The foundation was cracking. The roof leaked in 17 different places, and most concerning of all, strange sounds echoed from within its walls during winter storms. 3 separate renovation companies had walked away from estimates, citing structural issues that would cost more than the building could ever be worth. The asking price had dropped from $200,000 to $47,000, then to $15,000, and finally to a desperate plea for anyone willing to take it off the county's hands for back taxes. That's when Marcus Whitfield, a quiet cattle rancher from nearby Bozeman, made a decision that would change everything. Marcus wasn't looking for a church when he drove past the crumbling structure on Highway 191 that crisp October morning. He was actually headed to an auction in Livingston, hoping to find some used equipment for his struggling ranch. But something about the way morning light filtered through those broken windows made him pull his weathered Ford pickup onto the gravel shoulder. He'd driven this route countless times over the past 15 years, but today felt different. The church seemed to be calling to him, though Marcus wasn't a particularly religious man. His grandfather had been a Methodist preacher, but Marcus had lost his faith years ago when his wife Sarah died in a car accident, leaving him to raise their daughter Emma alone. Standing before the heavy oak doors, Marcus noticed something odd. Despite decades of abandonment, the brass handles weren't completely tarnished. Someone had been here recently. The realtor, Janet Morrison, seemed almost desperate when Marcus called about viewing the property. She arrived within 20 minutes, her high heels clicking nervously on the stone steps as she fumbled with an oversized key ring. Janet had been trying to unload this property for 6 years, ever since the diocese declared it surplus land. She warned Marcus about the structural issues, the strange acoustics that made footsteps echo like whispers, and the local legends about unexplained phenomena. But Marcus had dealt with old buildings before, and he needed a project to keep his mind occupied during the long Montana winters. What he discovered inside would haunt him for months and ultimately make him one of the wealthiest men in the state. The interior was more damaged than he'd expected. Water stains cascaded down walls like frozen tears, and sections of the wooden floor had rotted completely through. Pigeons had made nests in the rafters, and their droppings covered everything in a gray, chalky film. But beneath the decay, Marcus could see the church's original beauty. Hand-carved wooden pews, though weathered, showed intricate craftsmanship. The altar, partially hidden under a moldy tarp, was made of white marble that still gleamed where sunlight touched it. Most impressive was the pipe organ, a massive instrument that dominated the back wall. Despite years of neglect, its brass pipes caught the light like golden spears reaching toward heaven. Marcus spent 3 hours exploring every corner of the building, taking notes and measurements. In the basement, he found the old furnace room and storage areas that smelled of coal dust and decades-old incense. It was here that he noticed something unusual. One wall of the storage room was newer than the others, built with different stones and mortar. It looked like someone had sealed off a section of the basement, possibly in the 1960s based on the construction materials. Marcus made an offer that afternoon. $15,000 cash for the building and its 3 acres of land. Janet couldn't hide her relief as they signed papers in her dusty office above the hardware store in Three Forks. She even threw in all the church's remaining furnishings, including boxes of old records and religious artifacts stored in the rectory. Marcus planned to convert the building into a workshop and studio space, maybe rent it out for weddings once he fixed the major problems. His daughter Emma, now 25 and working as a teacher in Billings, thought he'd finally lost his mind. But Marcus needed this project. Since retiring from ranching due to a back injury, he'd felt purposeless, spending too many evenings alone with his thoughts and whiskey. The renovation began in earnest that November. Marcus hired Tom Bradley, a local contractor who specialized in historic buildings, to help with the major structural work. Tom had restored several old churches across Montana and knew the challenges they'd face. The roof came first, then the foundation repairs. It was slow, expensive work, but Marcus found satisfaction in bringing the building back to life. Every day brought small victories and new surprises. Behind a false wall in the rectory, they found a collection of handwritten sermons dating back to 1887. In the bell tower, wrapped in oilcloth, were brass instruments from the original church band. But the biggest surprise came in January, when they finally decided to investigate that newer wall in the basement. Tom had been curious about it since their first day, noting how it interrupted the natural flow of the foundation stones. Marcus had assumed it was just a 20th century addition, maybe installed to create more storage space or improve heating efficiency. But when they started removing stones to install new electrical conduits, they realized this wall was hiding something significant. The space behind it was much larger than expected, extending back into what must have been the church's original foundation. And it wasn't empty. Their flashlight beams revealed wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked carefully in the dry space. Some were marked with dates from the 1920s and 1930s. Others bore symbols that neither Marcus nor Tom recognized. The air inside smelled of cedar and something else, something that made Marcus think of his grandfather's study, filled with old books and mysterious artifacts from his missionary days. They spent the rest of that day carefully removing stones to create an opening large enough to enter. What they found inside would take months to fully understand and years to properly catalog. The first crate they opened contained Native American artifacts, but not the kind typically found in Montana. These were ceremonial pieces from tribes of the Pacific Northwest, intricately carved totem fragments, masks with abalone shell inlays, and woven baskets of extraordinary quality. Some pieces showed signs of great age, possibly pre-Columbian. Marcus knew enough about Western art to recognize museum-quality work when he saw it. But how had these artifacts ended up sealed in a church basement in rural Montana? The second crate held items from an entirely different culture and time period. Medieval European religious artifacts, including what appeared to be illuminated manuscript pages, silver chalices with Latin inscriptions, and wooden religious sculptures that could have been carved in 13th century monasteries. Tom, who had studied art history in college before becoming a contractor, examined each piece with growing amazement. These weren't replicas or tourist souvenirs. They were authentic historical artifacts worth potentially millions of dollars. As they opened more crates over the following weeks, the mystery deepened. Pre-Columbian pottery from South America, African masks and sculptures that seemed to predate European colonization, Asian artifacts including what looked like ancient Chinese ceramics and Japanese swords, and even Egyptian pieces, including canopic jars and jewelry that could have come from pharaonic tombs. It was as if someone had collected treasures from around the world and hidden them in this unlikely location. Marcus contacted Dr. Sarah Chun, an archaeologist at Montana State University, to examine some of the pieces. Dr. Chun arrived at the church on a snowy February morning, skeptical about what a rancher and contractor might have found in an old basement. But within an hour of examining the artifacts, she was making frantic phone calls to colleagues at the Smithsonian and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Each piece she examined appeared to be authentic, and several were unlike anything in existing museum collections. The Native American pieces alone could rewrite understanding of pre-Columbian trade networks. The medieval European items included religious texts that scholars had thought were lost forever. And the Egyptian artifacts, if authentic, could provide new insights into burial practices of the Middle Kingdom period. But Dr. Chen's excitement was tempered by serious questions about provenance. How had these artifacts been acquired? Were they stolen from museums, archaeological sites, or indigenous communities? And why had someone hidden them in a Montana church basement decades ago? Marcus began researching the church's history, spending long hours in county archives and libraries across the state. The building had been constructed in 1885 by the Northern Pacific Railway as part of their effort to encourage settlement along their new line to Seattle. The original pastor, Reverend William Morrison, had served until his death in 1923. His replacement, Reverend David Mackenzie, had led the congregation through the Great Depression and World War II before retiring in 1967. It was Mackenzie who had overseen major renovations in the 1960s, including basement improvements that must have involved sealing off the hidden room. Mackenzie had died in 1972, taking whatever secrets he knew to his grave. But Marcus found something interesting in the church records. Beginning in 1925, just 2 years after Mackenzie's arrival, the church had received unusually large donations from anonymous benefactors. These donations continued sporadically until 1962, always in cash, always substantial enough to fund major improvements or community programs. The timing coincided exactly with the period when the artifacts must have been hidden. Marcus also discovered that Mackenzie had traveled extensively before taking the Montana position. Church records showed he had served as a missionary in China from 1919 to 1922, had spent time in Mexico and Peru in 1923, and had made several trips to Europe and Africa in the early 1920s. It seemed possible that Mackenzie had somehow acquired these artifacts during his travels, but the sheer scope of the collection suggested something more complex than simple missionary collecting. The breakthrough came when Marcus found Mackenzie's personal papers in the archives of the Montana Historical Society. Among sermons and correspondence was a leather-bound journal that Mackenzie had kept from 1920 to 1965. The early entries described his missionary work and growing concern about cultural artifacts being destroyed or lost due to political upheavals, wars, and colonial exploitation around the world. Mackenzie had apparently made contacts with museum curators, private collectors, and indigenous leaders who shared his concerns about preserving cultural heritage. But the journal also revealed Mackenzie's involvement with a secretive network of collectors and preservationists who operated outside official channels. They called themselves the Custodians, and their mission was to acquire and protect artifacts that were at risk of destruction or disappearance. Sometimes this meant purchasing items from legitimate sources, but Mackenzie's journal hinted at more questionable methods, including removing artifacts from sites that were about to be destroyed by war, development, or natural disasters. The journal entries from the 1930s and 1940s described Mackenzie's increasing anxiety about world events. He wrote about artifacts disappearing during the Chinese Civil War, Native American burial sites being destroyed by mining operations, and European cultural treasures being looted during World War II. The Custodians saw themselves as protectors of human heritage, preserving items that would otherwise be lost forever. But by the 1950s, Mackenzie's tone had changed. He wrote about legal challenges facing collectors, new international laws governing cultural property, and growing pressure from governments and indigenous groups seeking return of artifacts. Several custodian members had been arrested or sued, and the network was dissolving. Mackenzie decided to seal his portion of the collection, hoping that future generations might find better ways to preserve and share these cultural treasures. His final entry, dated December 1965, expressed hope that someday the artifacts could be returned to their rightful communities or displayed in museums where they could educate and inspire people from all cultures. Marcus shared this information with Dr. Chun, who had been working with international experts to authenticate and trace the artifacts. The good news was that most pieces appeared to have been acquired legally, at least by the standards of Mackenzie's era. Many came from private collections or estates rather than active archaeological sites. The Native American artifacts were more problematic, as some had clearly been removed from burial sites or sacred locations without proper permission. But even these appeared to have been acquired decades before modern laws protecting such sites were enacted. Dr. Chun arranged for representatives from various museums and cultural institutions to examine the collection. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian sent 2 experts to evaluate the Native American pieces. The Metropolitan Museum dispatched their curator of medieval art to examine the European artifacts. Similar specialists arrived to assess the African, Asian, and Egyptian pieces. Each group reached the same conclusion: the collection was authentic, extraordinary, and potentially worth tens of millions of dollars. But they also agreed that many items should be returned to their communities of origin, regardless of their current legal ownership. Marcus found himself in an unprecedented situation. Legally, the artifacts were his property, purchased along with the church building. But morally, he felt obligated to honor Mackenzie's apparent intention that these treasures serve educational and cultural purposes rather than personal enrichment. After months of consultation with lawyers, museum experts, and representatives from various indigenous and cultural groups, Marcus developed a plan that would satisfy everyone involved. The most significant Native American artifacts would be returned to appropriate tribal communities, with Marcus asking only that their stories be preserved and shared. Items clearly stolen or improperly acquired would be returned to their countries of origin through proper diplomatic channels. The remaining artifacts, those legitimately acquired and of general historical rather than specific cultural significance, would be donated to museums with the understanding that they would be displayed and studied rather than stored in warehouses. Marcus retained only enough items to fund the complete restoration of the church building, which he planned to convert into a cultural center and museum dedicated to Mackenzie's story and the importance of protecting cultural heritage. The financial value of his retained items was still substantial, estimated at over $15 million by conservative appraisals. But the real value lay in the relationships Marcus had built with museums, universities, and cultural organizations around the world. The church renovation became an international project, with experts from the Smithsonian providing conservation advice, Native American artists contributing to the design of exhibition spaces, and scholars from several universities collaborating on research into Mackenzie's network and the broader history of cultural preservation efforts. The grand reopening took place on a warm June day, exactly 2 years after Marcus had first walked through those heavy oak doors. Representatives from dozens of museums and cultural organizations attended, along with members of several Native American tribes whose artifacts had been returned to them. Dr. Chun, now a close friend and collaborator, gave the dedication speech, praising Marcus for his decision to prioritize cultural preservation over personal profit. The ceremony concluded with a blessing from tribal elders and a performance by the church's restored pipe organ, played by a musician who had traveled from Germany specifically for the occasion. Emma, Marcus's daughter, stood beside her father as they watched visitors explore the new cultural center. She had initially worried about his expensive obsession with the old church, but now she understood what had driven him. This project had given Marcus a new purpose and connected him to a community of people who shared his grandfather's commitment to preserving and sharing cultural knowledge. The center quickly became a destination for scholars, tourists, and anyone interested in the complex history of cultural preservation. Mackenzie's story resonated with visitors from around the world, many of whom had their own family histories involving artifacts, collections, and the challenges of balancing preservation with cultural respect. Marcus often served as a guide, sharing the story of his discovery and the lessons he had learned about the responsibilities that come with unexpected fortune. But the most rewarding moments came when indigenous visitors recognized artifacts that had been returned to their communities, now properly preserved and displayed in tribal cultural centers where they could educate new generations about their heritage. Marcus had achieved something that Mackenzie could only have dreamed of, finding a way to preserve cultural treasures while respecting the rights and wishes of their originating communities. The abandoned church that nobody wanted had become a symbol of how individual actions can honor both the past and the future, bridging cultures and generations through the shared human desire to understand and preserve our collective heritage. In the end, Marcus's quiet decision to purchase a crumbling building had unleashed a treasure trove that enriched museums and communities around the world, proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from seeking fortune, but from simply caring enough to preserve what others have abandoned. As news of the discovery spread through academic and cultural circles, Marcus found himself at the center of a story that captured international attention. Documentary filmmakers arrived from New York and London, eager to tell the tale of the rancher who had stumbled upon one of the most significant private artifact collections ever found in North America. But Marcus remained focused on the deeper implications of his discovery, working tirelessly to ensure that Mackenzie's legacy would inspire future generations of cultural preservationists. The success of the Cultural Center attracted visitors from every continent. Archaeologists came to study Mackenzie's methods and network, hoping to locate other hidden collections that might still exist in unexpected places. Art historians analyzed the artifacts to better understand trade routes and cultural exchanges that had previously been unknown to scholars. Most importantly, representatives from indigenous communities around the world visited to learn how the repatriation process had worked, using Marcus's approach as a model for similar situations. 3 years after the discovery, Marcus received a letter that would prove to be the final piece of Mackenzie's puzzle. It came from an elderly woman in Vancouver named Margaret Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chun, who had read about the Montana discovery in a museum newsletter. Margaret's grandfather had been a Presbyterian minister who had worked with Mackenzie in China during the early 1920s. She had inherited a small collection of artifacts and documents that she had never fully understood, but Mackenzie's story helped her recognize their significance. Among her grandfather's papers was a detailed map showing the locations of several other custodian caches across the American West. Mackenzie and his colleagues had apparently hidden collections in at least 6 other locations, including an abandoned mine in Colorado, a defunct trading post in Wyoming, and a forgotten missionary school in New Mexico. Each site had been carefully chosen for its isolation and the likelihood that the buildings would remain undisturbed for decades. Margaret's revelation sparked a new phase of Marcus's mission. Working with a team of archaeologists, historians, and legal experts, he helped coordinate efforts to locate and properly handle these additional discoveries. Not all of the sites still contained intact collections. Some had been disturbed by natural disasters or development, but 3 yielded significant finds that further expanded understanding of early 20th century efforts to preserve cultural heritage. The Colorado mine contained primarily geological specimens and Native American artifacts from the Southwest, including pottery and textiles that had been saved from sites threatened by mining operations. The Wyoming Trading Post held a remarkable collection of Plains Indian artifacts, including items that had been given to Mackenzie by tribal leaders who trusted him to preserve them for future generations. The New Mexico School yielded the most surprising discovery, a collection of pre-Columbian manuscripts and codices that scholars had believed were destroyed during the Spanish conquest. Each new discovery reinforced the complexity of Mackenzie's network and the sophisticated understanding these early preservationists had possessed about the threats facing cultural heritage sites. They had operated during an era when legal protections for such sites barely existed, when archaeological excavation was often indistinguishable from treasure hunting, and when indigenous communities had little power to protect their own cultural property. The custodians had tried to fill that gap, sometimes imperfectly, but always with genuine commitment to preservation over profit. Marcus's role in these subsequent discoveries cemented his reputation as an advocate for ethical cultural preservation. Museums began consulting him when they encountered questionable collections, seeking his advice on how to balance historical value with cultural sensitivity. Universities invited him to speak about the importance of provenance research and the responsibilities that come with inheriting or discovering cultural artifacts. The original Church Cultural Center became headquarters for the Mackenzie Foundation, a nonprofit organization that Marcus established to continue the Reverend's work using modern, transparent, and culturally respectful methods. The foundation worked with indigenous communities to document and preserve oral histories, supported archaeological projects that prioritized community involvement over academic prestige, and provided funding for small museums and cultural centers in remote areas where traditional funding sources were unavailable. Emma, Marcus's daughter, took a sabbatical from teaching to help establish the foundation's educational programs. She developed curricula that helped students understand the complex relationships between cultural preservation, indigenous rights, and historical scholarship. The programs were adopted by schools across Montana and eventually expanded to other states, reaching thousands of young people who might never have otherwise considered these issues. As Marcus approached his 70th birthday, he often reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken since that October morning when he had pulled his truck over to look at an abandoned church. What had begun as a simple renovation project had evolved into a global network of cultural preservation efforts that continued to grow and adapt to new challenges. The church itself remained the heart of it all, its restored stained glass windows casting colored light on displays that told stories of human creativity and resilience from every corner of the world. Visitors often commented on the building's peaceful atmosphere, noting how it seemed to embody Mackenzie's vision of cultural treasures serving as bridges between different peoples and traditions rather than barriers or sources of conflict. Marcus had achieved something that few people ever do. He had transformed an accidental discovery into a lasting legacy that honored both the past and the future. The artifacts that had been hidden in darkness for decades now educated and inspired visitors from around the world, while the communities from which they had come received recognition and resources that helped them preserve their own cultural heritage for future generations. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors had departed and the cultural center settled into peaceful silence, Marcus would sometimes walk through the exhibits alone, remembering Mackenzie's words from that final journal entry about hoping that future generations would find better ways to preserve and share cultural treasures. The Reverend's hope had been fulfilled, but more importantly, his example had inspired a new generation of people who understood that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we preserve and protect for those who will come after us. The abandoned church that nobody had wanted had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the most forgotten places can hold treasures that, when shared with wisdom and respect, enrich the entire world. Marcus's quiet act of curiosity had unleashed a legacy that would continue long after his own story had ended, ensuring that Mackenzie's vision of cultural preservation as a sacred trust would inspire generations yet to come.